Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Sandra Morgan, and I'm pleased to serve as moderator for this conversation, which is a part of our series, Jews Around the World. Today's conversation explores the Jewish community in Kaifeng, China, which has existed for about 700 years. Before I make introductions, I'd like to remind you that your microphones are muted, but not your voices. We look forward to excellent conversation and insightful questions. Today, the conversation will be presented in 3 sections, and you are invited to ask questions after each one. Of course, you're always invited to ask questions at the end. To ask a question, please select the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen and type it there. You may also join the conversation in the chat section, and we've had some wonderful conversations in the chat, so please stay tuned. As always, we ask that your questions be courteous, productive, and on topic. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce Chaya Kessler, Director of Jewish Studies here at Kent State University, and program partner, Dr. Jacob Lebenz, Director of Judaic and Holocaust Studies at Youngstown State University. Chaya, Jacob, take it away.
Good evening. Welcome, everybody. This is such a pleasure. This is our third, actually, in a sense, in this series. Today, we're going far away to China, but I would like to welcome you. This is a fantastic opportunity for Jewish Studies at Kent State and Youngstown State University to program together. These programs are all underwritten by the Youngstown Area Jewish Federation, and we thank them very much for their support. Please stay tuned, and Jacob, it's to you.
Hi, welcome everybody. If you are in the part of the world where I am, good evening. I'm glad you can join us at this late hour. I want to thank my partners at Kent State University as well. I'm going to hand the floor quickly over to Dr. Adam Fuller, who is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science and International Relations, or Politics and International Relations at Youngstown State University, so a colleague of mine, and our connection to our guest speaker. But before I do that, we're going to place in the chat and make available to you information about further programming. And I will also add that on March 18th, I will be holding our semesterly Jewish Muslim Forum with Dr. Mustanzer Mir, who runs the Center for Islamic Studies at Youngstown State University. That will be at 7:00 p.m. and I will post information about that in the chat as well. If you would like to sign up for the events list, for the mailing list of the Center for Judaic and Holocaust Studies at Youngstown State University, you may leave me a note in the chat as well. It's probably best to send it directly. Thank you. And so I now give the floor to Adam. Dr. Fuller.
Yes, it is my pleasure to introduce you to Rabbi Dr. Moshe Yehuda Bernstein. He is an adjunct research fellow in the Faculty of Humanities at Curtin University in Perth, Australia. So he's in sunny Australia speaking to us today. As you could see behind him, it's summer down in the Southern Hemisphere. Rabbi Dr. Bernstein has taught Talmud and Kabbalah and has a PhD in Asian studies. He's interesting for a lot of reasons, but one of them is he's intimately familiar, intimately knowledgeable about 2 cultures, the Jewish culture and the Chinese culture. He's one of the world's foremost experts on the Jews of Kaifeng. It's a community that we all know exists, but always seems to be something of a curiosity that we don't really know much about. So I'm looking forward to hearing the talk today. He's the author of Globalization, Translation, and Transmission, Sino-Judaic Cultural Identity in Kaifeng, China, which was published in 2017. And he's also, by the way, kind of in politics now in Australia. Kind of a new thing that he's kind of become involved in. But today we're going to hear him speak about the Jews of Kaifeng. So I'll hand it over now to Rabbi Dr. Bernstein.
Okay, good morning. As was stated, I'm going to really divide this into 3 parts because The idea is then and now, the history of the Kaifeng Jews. So the first part, I'm going to use a PowerPoint, a few slides to give you like a brief overview of the history. And I'll stop that at halfway through and take any questions related to the history. The second section will be a little bit of the background in contemporary China that has led to the situation today that many of you know about. There's the community in Kaifeng is currently being repressed. It's shut off from its former connections. And that will be about 15 minutes, and I'll take a break there. In the last 10 minutes, I just want to deal with my own personal contact with the community, how that was shut off, and really kind of analyzing the current situation, which, if you saw an article in the Telegraph that came out about a month ago, is not very good. People are feeling fearful. They're in secret in Kaifeng, as are many people with Xi Jinping's repression of contacts with the outside world. So we'll get into that. But before I start, I just want to clarify something. You know, I've given this talk before to Jewish audiences and explained the situation. The word Jewish and the Kaifeng Jews is a neologism in Kaifeng. For years, from the time that the first Jewish settlers arrived 1,000 years ago, they called themselves, in Chinese, the name was translated as Yitzhaleya, which is kind of like Israelites. In modern Chinese, the word for Israel is Yisrael, 3 syllables. This is Yitzhaleya. And it seems that they didn't even know the idea of Jews. As you know, it's not really mentioned. The word Jew is not mentioned in the Torah. We're called Am Yisrael, the nation of Israel. We'll mention it actually in some readings, like tomorrow night, for us anyway, tomorrow night is the Megillah reading, where it says, Liyudim Hayta Ora B'Simcha and Mordechai Ish Yehudi. You have that idea, but they didn't have that in China. It was actually introduced by Christian missionaries at the end of the 20th century. And interestingly, if you look at, you know, every Chinese character has a radical, and the radical for the word yotai, which means Jew, is the dog radical, which is kind of derogatory. So the idea is that really, even today, on a ontological level, and not even today, for the past few hundred years or several hundred years, there really have not been any halachic Jews in Kaifeng. There are self-identifying Jews. They call themselves Kaifeng Yotairen, which means Kaifeng Jews. But when you talk to them in private, they'll call themselves Kaifeng Yotai Hoyi, Kaifeng Jewish descendants, which they know they are. And the reason for that is early on in the game, and we'll discuss this later, the Jews of Kaifeng who came from Central Asia, Persia, they spoke Judeo-Persian, they married Chinese wives. And although these wives took Jewish names, you have a whole record in what they call the book of the memorial book. They list the names of these wives that took on Hebrew names and took on traditions of their husband, as is the custom in China. When a woman married, she would go to the husband's house. But yet, because those were not what we call halachic conversions, which of course was introduced much later in the Talmud, they are not considered halachically Jewish, and they know that. And 22 of their offspring who have moved to Israel and made Aliyah have had to undergo conversion, Orthodox conversion, to be part of the Jewish people. With that said, the irony is that of all the different lost tribes and pockets of self-identifying Jews, from the B'nai Menashe in Burma to the Abu Yadaya in Uganda, there's some in South Africa, the Inca tribes, the Kaifeng Jews are really the only ones that actually have a real Jewish history. The others, you know, like the B'nai Menashe, which was touted as the 12th tribe, really started as one of the tribal leaders having a dream only 150 years ago that they should all convert to Judaism. So there's two things you have to bear in mind when we talk about the Kaifeng Jews. No, they are not halachic Jews, but yes, they are self-identifying Jews. And my whole thesis was to find out the reason why did they identify that way. So we're going to look into that a little bit in the past and present. I'm going to start with my PowerPoint now. I'll just open that here and then share that with you. 1 second. Yeah, back here. Sorry. Zoom. Oops. I'm trying to find that page again that we were on. 1 second. Here, share screen. And this. Do you see that?
We see it.
Yes, that's okay. So, yes, I spoke about that. Now, just before I start, there's one concept that I want to introduce. You know, when I started my thesis, there's a big thing in social sciences is cultural hybridity. It often comes in post-colonial studies and is often looked at negatively, something that was imposed upon, you know, subaltern cultures by colonialists. When I started, I was trying to use the word hybridity, and my first supervisor, who really deals more with Muslim studies, and she left after the first year, she had problems with the word hybridity. And she said, because hybridity in biology is related to non-productivity, to sterility. And culture is very fecund. Culture reproduces itself. So in my title, I use the idea of translation instead of hybridity. You know that even linguistic translation, we have things that are like anomalies. Just look at the word hello, right? Hello. In Hebrew, that word is shalom. In Arabic, salam. It means a different thing, really, than just hello. In German or French, it's guten Tag, bonjour. It also means a different thing. In Chinese, ni hao means you are good. So we're taking the concept of hello. When we say ni hao in China, we don't really mean the exact same thing. And the same thing in terms of culture. So what Fernando Ortiz said, and he's from way back before they had the idea of cultural hybridity, he had this idea of transculturation, that there's this constant process of cultures interacting and losing part of their previous culture, which he says is deculturation, and gaining new stuff, which is neoculturation. And in the end, he says, if you read in the bottom here, this bold type, the result of every union of cultures is similar to that of the reproductive process between individuals. The offspring always has something of both parents, but is always different from each of them. So I want you to bear this in mind as we go through the history, because what you're going to see was there was a transculturation process between a group of Jews that came from Central Asia, went to China, and because of the syncretistic nature of Chinese culture with different various sects in Taoism, Buddhism, Confucianism, and kind of permeable cultural boundaries, a kind of transculturation occurred that signified their Judaism in a very successful way that allowed it to endure for quite a long time. And you're going to see in the second part, kind of a reverse process where China finally opens up and there are all these global influences that happen. It takes the Kaifeng Jewish community, who by that time, by the 20th century, had lost almost every shred of any knowledge of Hebrew or Jewish tradition. They knew they had ancestors from Israel, but those global influences worked again to cause a process of transculturation that has revived Judaism. But it is not the same Judaism that their ancestors took from Persia or from Central Asia and then had signified. Is quite a different kettle of fish. All right, so we're going to start now with the historical overview. Sorry, I'm not on an interview anymore. That's the political thing I'm doing. Okay, the historical overview. If you look here, you'll see the city of Kaifeng, which was the capital of the Song dynasty 1,000 years ago. You can see that it's located at that time, it's on a junction between the Yellow River and the Grand Canal, which had a lot of economic benefits at that time. Excuse me, particularly because that was before the port cities opened up with the advent of Portuguese, British, Dutch, French, German, all sorts of colonial powers coming in. Before that, it was really commerce on the Yellow River and Grand Canal. And most importantly, Kaifeng was the terminus of the Silk Road. The actual terminus was Xi'an, where the terracotta warriors are. That's about, I guess, 1,000 kilometers westward. But Kaifeng was really the biggest city where once it reached Xi'an, it ended in Kaifeng. And in its day, Kaifeng was the world's largest city. It was the capital of the Song, and it was the world's largest city for over a century. There was, at the time of about 1,000 years ago, 1 million inhabitants of Kaifeng from all over, because it was really a cosmopolitan city, compared to less than 10,000 in London at the time. So not many people know that this was a huge place for commerce and cosmopolitanism and a very multicultural society. Now, when this group of Jews came to China, and there is a debate on where they came from and how they came, right? They spoke a dialect of Judean Persian, which some people say might mean they came from Persia. It's much more likely they came from Central Asian countries. At that time, don't forget that Uzbekistan, Samarkand was a big terminus on the Silk Road, and all those areas in Central Asia, the stans, had a 20% Jewish population at the time. It was sparsely populated, but there were a lot of Jews there. There's another theory, because these Jews came and they were dyers of cotton cloth, which was practiced in India at that time. There's a second theory that they actually came by boat to China and went inland to Kaifeng. Most Chinese academics accept the first theory, that it was the Silk Road journey. So that's kind of the majority opinion. And when they came to Kaifeng, the emperor there, the Song Emperor, Emperor Zhenzong, said to them, "You have come to China, revere and preserve the customs of your ancestors and hand them down at Bianliang." Bianliang was the name of the Kaifeng at that time. So this is really important that, this emperor, apart from giving that commandment, and that's so Chinese, to revere and preserve the customs of your ancestors. You'd think he was giving them like a rabbinical imperative, but that's part of Confucian and Chinese culture. And it's very important to remember this, that you preserve the customs of your ancestors. That's one of the reasons why, and a lot of people don't understand why there was this revival of identity, which some cynical forces blame it on, material gains, that the Kaifeng Jews just had a lot to gain in terms of money and power by linking themselves to foreign organizations. But in my interviews with them, I found that that's kind of a cynical view that ignores what's going on inside, the subjective view. And as Chinese and as Confucians, this idea of who your ancestors are and what they did and what you do to honor them is of primary importance. All right, so they, in 1489, 1512, 1663, 3 different times in history, the Kaifeng Jews wrote all of their oral history onto stele, onto these monuments in Chinese. They were placed in the outer courtyard of the synagogue, which I'll show you later on. It's kind of modeled after it looks like a Chinese version of a Beit Mikdash, of the temple. And it was on the outside, which leads one to believe, was this history written kind of as a propaganda exercise for the outside world, or was it written for the Congregationalists? It is replete with, in a certain sense, anyone who's read Pirkei Avot, and you see how it starts, that the Torah was given to Moshe and then passed down to this one. They started out with Abraham, and they go through a whole, they start out with Adam, and they go through a whole, not a cosmology, but a whole genealogy of how the Torah was passed down. And intermittently, in telling this, they'll often say, and Moses was the lawgiver, and the laws he gave were not so different than the noble Kongzi, than the noble Confucius. So there was an attempt by the Jews of China to integrate and to feel one with Chinese culture. And the truth of the matter is, when we look at it, one of the unique features of the Chinese diaspora, the Jewish diaspora in China, compared to Europe, was this acceptance, was the fact that nobody looked at them and go, oh, look at those Jews. They didn't have the whole baggage of Christian Europe that put Jews in ghettos and lots of restrictions on what they could do, the guilds they could join, and intermittent persecutions. None of that happened in China. Jews were accepted. They were able to go through the system of the imperial exams and get high positions. In fact, if the statistics are right, they were disproportionately represented in the imperial exam and in the civil service. So this is very important. Now, I wrote here that this was on display for private viewing. I've seen these things, these stelae, at least 2 times, maybe 3. But to do so, you have to know, if this was in the past, you had to pay. The municipal museum in Kaifeng is free. But if you know about these stelae, you pay an extra 50 yuan. And for that, they would take you upstairs to an attic, a very dusty attic. And these are the most important. They don't have anything else from 1489 in that museum. It's pretty kitschy, But these things, you have to pay a fine. You had to pay a fine. You go upstairs and you see it in these glass cases. There's a guard there, very strict, making sure you don't take a photo, right? And we tried. I went up the last time with some Israelis who tried some, what do you call it in English, kunsim tactics to be able to distract the guard, but it did not work. And he said he would have to call the police if we took a picture. Since 2018, that's right, this is closed off. No one can see these anymore. The new policy that I'm going to talk about in the end, which is basically a denial of even the history of the Kaifeng Jews, a very counterproductive policy, in my view, has taken these out of the public view along with some other things. All right. They also built in Kaifeng a synagogue, which really, well, even though they arrived there around the year 1000, it wasn't until about 100, 150 years after that they first constructed the synagogue. That synagogue was destroyed and rebuilt several times because the Yellow River was just a disaster, right? It was constantly over flooding. And here's the thing I had to wonder, if these people, this is kind of an aside, but the view when most people hear, oh, well, they married Chinese wives. Yeah, they were weak. They went after their, they had no choice or they didn't know. But they went to great expense to keep rebuilding that synagogue for 700 years. And if they thought with all the marrying of, Chinese women that they had married out of Judaism somehow, why did they invest all that in it? They still, that identity as Jews never faded in their minds, and it leads me to believe, and there are books that have been written about this, that really the idea of matrilineal descent that the Talmud tells us, it's always been that way. An easy reading of the Tanakh lets you know that it hasn't, and that it was rather a late development. And it can very well be that in places like in Central Asia, where the Talmud hadn't even reached yet in the 10th century, that's where the information came out about matrilineal descent. It's not in the Torah except by allusion, that they were still following patrilineal descent as their ancestors had done. That's kind of a controversial position, but I do put that forth in my thesis. In 1605, something very interesting happened that would kind of change the trajectory of the Kaifeng Jews and bring news of them to Europe. And that is the meeting of the Jesuit head of the Chinese mission, Matteo Ricci, with Aitian, a Kaifeng Jew in 1605. I'll just take a minute to tell the story is rather interesting because this Kaifeng Jew, Aitian, had heard that there was some figure that had come to Beijing who believed in one God. And being of the, a Kaifeng Yitzhaleya, they also believed in him. He thought it was somebody Jewish. And Matteo Ricci, when he heard there was a monotheist to greet him, he knew there were some Nestorian Christians in Western China, I think in Xinjiang or in that area, even less in number than the 5,000 or so 5,000 or so Kaifeng Jews at their peak that was more the 15th century. It's probably less now because the coastal cities were building up and there was immigration. But Matteo Ricci thought this was a Christian. So when they met, it was this, what do you call it, like a identity problem, and where Matteo Ricci thought this was a Christian and I Chen thought this was a Jew. And so Matteo Ricci welcomed him in and took him to his study, and there was a portrait of Mary with Jesus and John the Baptist. And I Chen saw it and thought, okay, that's Rachel with Jacob and Esau. He interpreted it all wrong until they finally found out who they were. Matteo Ricci wrote about this in his Lettre de Fiant. He wrote about his meeting. And between that time, 1605, and 120 years later, when when Jesuits would be banned from Kaifeng because of the rights controversy, I may get into that a little bit later, there were visits to Kaifeng by Jesuits who did everything possible. The Jesuits gave us all our knowledge of the Kaifeng Jews. And in this picture it's a picture, it was copied by Père Bruckner, but it was by Père Jean Domange in 1722, one of the last to visit. I believe he was also one of the few Hebrew speakers that visited. In 1642, there was a huge catastrophe from the Yellow River that didn't just destroy the synagogue. It was the largest man-made genocide until that time. It destroyed the city of Kaifeng and killed 300,000 people. And it was done during the rebellion of Li Zicheng, who surrounded the city, had it in siege. But it's unclear whether the erosion of the dam system in the Yellow River was caused by the rebel forces or was caused actually by the loyalist forces that were trying to get water down to the starving city. But in any event, a big storm and the erosions of the dikes caused something to happen. It was at the beginning of Sukkot, I believe, or it was the end of Sukkot. Might have been Simchat Torah. I have to look that date up again. But it was what happened was there was a storm, and when the dams broke, there was just this huge tidal wave that came in like a tsunami and just engulfed the whole city, and of course destroyed the synagogue and the Jewish community. They were in exile for about 10 years until one of their number, Zhao Yincheng, who became a high minister of justice, he was very wealthy. About 10 years later, 1655 or so, 13 years, put all his efforts into rebuilding the city of Kaifeng and rebuilding the synagogue. But with that said, the synagogue had a final demise in 1849, not like the 1642 flood, but the point is, by that time, the Jewish population had so decreased that they were unable to build it. And the Torah scrolls and manuscripts were sold to Christian emissaries in 1851. And I'll show you here, this is a picture also by Domange of how they used to read the Torah in Kaifeng. Notice this is in the Qing dynasty. They didn't wear talitot, and I never see pictures of tefillin. They did have a prompter. They did hold the Torah in what they called, what Domange called the chaise de Moïse, the Moshe's chair, I guess what we call Kisei Eliyahu. So they had some different things. This is one of the 14 Torah scrolls available that's in the British Library. There are some in Toronto and where else? I think one in Texas. They're all over the world, these Torah scrolls that have been recovered and that were bought by Anglican missionaries in 1851, as I said. Why did these Christians want these Torah scrolls? From the beginning on, from the first time the Jesuits came, there were people like the philosopher Leibniz in Europe arguing, we have to get the Kaifeng Torahs. They knew about this because of Matteo Ricci's writings. And what they thought was, because first of all, these people they didn't know the word yotai, Jew. They were Yitzhaliah, and it was thought they really came from the Assyrian exile some 700 years before the Roman exile. They didn't know the idea of Judea or whatever. Because of that, there were Christians that assumed these Torahs are the real primordial Torahs, and if we get our hands on them, it will be the true Torah that will tell us of the coming of Jesus Christ, unlike the adulterated Torahs they have in Europe, which the Talmudic rabbis cheated on. Islam has a similar thing about our Torah, that it's kind of the rewritten by the rabbis and not original, but this was a Christian thing. And it took them how many years? They started in the beginning, 17th century. They got them in 1851. And when they finally got the Torahs, they found that apart from a few, orthographic errors that were natural in time, it was exactly the same Torahs that have been used everywhere. Because actually, these Torahs didn't come out of Assyria in 7 BC. They were brought by, on the Silk Road later on by travelers that knew there's a Jewish community in Kaifeng. So I haven't seen this Torah straight up, but it is there. Finally, just to finish off the first section, we'll jump ahead to the beginning of the 20th century, where you had Bishop William C. White, who was the first Anglican bishop of Henan. Henan province is the province that Kaifeng is located in. And as it was the case with most, Christian evangelists, he did want to bring the Jewish community together, but he definitely had this, or seemed to have this idea of supersessionism, that that getting them to be Jewish was the step on the way to getting them back to be Christians. He took over the last stele that they had found. He had transferred that stele. I think it was the 1489 one and 1512 on the other side, to the courtyard of Trinity Church. You walk into Trinity Church back then in the beginning of the 20th century, and you saw this stele from the old Jewish community that he appropriated as his own. And what he wrote there, I'm trying to read it if I can get this thing off here. It says, "No spark of interest," or what's that? What does it say there? My thing is covering it. I can't get it off. "No spark of interest or enthusiasm," or what? You don't see. "And in the divine heritage of Israel could be aroused in them. They were Jews no longer, either in a religious sense or as a community." And that's a picture of the community. And it's true. At that point, they probably knew nothing except that their ancestors came from Israel. A few of them didn't eat pork. That had been passed down. But that was a very common thing in Kaifeng, because there's many Hue Muslims that also didn't eat pork. So that's about all they had at that point. And Bishop White did little to be able to instill any enthusiasm or interest in them. So now I'm going to come off this for a second. Stop. How do I unshare screen? Stop share, new share, pause share. I'll do stop share. There. Can you see me now? Yes?
Yeah.
Are there any questions at this point you might want to ask, or shall I go on? It's up to you.
Well, sir, at the moment, I don't see any questions. I've seen a few. Oh, wait a minute. Someone has raised their hand.
On the past.
Yes, 2 people have raised their hands. And the first one I can't remember. Oh, sorry. All right, for the 2 of you who have raised your hands, Wilhelmina Davis has asked, or Davidson, I'm sorry, is asking the question. Wilhelmina, I believe that you may be muted. There you are. Please ask your question.
Yeah, so these steles you mentioned,
Yeah.
where can we find translations of these texts?
All right. there is a book, and I think it's called The Kaifeng Inscriptions, and I'm just trying to remember the author. I will pass that on. It slipped my mind at the moment. That's part of the problem of being 68 years old, where something's on the tip of your tongue and I'll remember it in about an hour. But I think it's called The Kaifeng Inscriptions, and there it's translated. I have to be honest, I had issues with some of the translation. He's trying, the translator tries to make the issue that these were really secret ways to get the Kaifeng Jewish community to always remember their heritage. I don't see it as such. I think it's more likely it was part of a PR exercise. So I'm not happy with it. With that said, I think that might be one of the only translations, except for a very old book by Bishop White, William C. White. It's called the Jews of Kaifeng Fu, a weird name. That's from the beginning of the 20th century. And that translation suffers from being, he was a very, how can I say it, overly florid translation of the Chinese. So there's not really a good translation, but the Kaifeng inscriptions might be your best, but you have to read it with a grain of salt.
Thank you so much.
Are there other questions?
All right. Shall I go on now with my?
Oh, I was
Yes?
waiting to see if there's other people. I think I'd like to ask a question for the history part of this. And it's this, and I want to make clear that I'm not challenging anyone's Jewish identity. I think this is a community of Jews. But I'm wondering about the article written by Zhao Jun in Orientalism and the Jews, where he challenges the origin story, not the Jewishness of the people necessarily, but that his argument is that, and I'm saying this for the people, not for you. I understand that you've read it. That the Jewish identification of the community as Jewish, not as different, but as specifically Jewish, had to do with contact with Christian missionaries. And then a self-understanding emerged from this, wherein they became Jews. Some of the writing is that cynical approach that you mentioned, but I think that there is a way to redeem that. And the reason why I'm asking is because some decade ago, I did a lot of reading about the Jews of Kaifeng, and that means I haven't read anything for 10 years. But a lot of the proofs for origins seemed somewhat specious. They depended on a lot of interpretation and bringing Judaism to the text. So I'm wondering how you respond really to Zhao Jun, but also to this sort of intellectual this origin story.
There's been a lot of intellectual challenges by pro-Chinese government people that want to try and disprove the whole thing. I find it, they know that the synagogue existed. Those pictures that they painted by John Domenge existed. We know exactly where the synagogue was. We know there are 14 Torah scrolls that came from Kaifeng. It's unlikely that even with Jesuit influence or whatever, the original people that got those Torah scrolls would not have got them. They had Siddurim, they had all sorts of other kind of books that they used for prayer. The Jesuits were there and marked their celebration of Sukkot, marked their celebrations of circumcision. All those things seem to be in a historical record that you'd be hard pressed to say it was people other than Jews that did this. I think the question is more like, what type of Jews were they? Like I've told you that in the past, I've given this talk to Jewish audiences and they come up afterwards but they aren't really Jews, are they? No, they're not really halachic Jews, but the whole question is, with all this mixture that they have coming into China and picking up some of Confucianism, some of Taoism, that on their, even though their stele were in Chinese language, well, actually in the synagogue, they had placards in Chinese and they called God, the word they used was Dao, which is the way, or Tian, which means heaven. They took out the anthropomorphic connotations and really went to a Chinese kind of more ethereal understanding through the translation that happened. this was part of what I said before, the rights controversy. I'll just mention now. You probably know that there was a historical controversy between the Jesuits and the Dominicans regarding rights in China. The Jesuits wanted the flexibility to be able to translate God's name in this non-anthropomorphic way, as the Chinese did, and they got that from the Kaifeng Jews, right? The Dominicans, absolutely not. You have to call it Shangdi. It has to be able to imply that God has a human form or whatever. And it went on for a long time until finally they went, according to the Dominicans, 120 years, I guess it was 1725 or something, and that made the Emperor Kangxi so mad that they went after the Dominicans. He banned all the Jesuits from any visits to inland China after that. So, but what's interesting is the Kaifeng Jews played kind of an instrumental part in that. So I don't think there's anything that can really deny the historical origins of those Jews that came there. What is in question, and how you look at it, is how fast did they lose their, technical Jewish status? And to me, I'll tell you, as a researcher, what was most important is not that, are you Jews or not, but why do you think you're Jews? And what did that lead you? What did that lead you to believe? What in your theology differed? It's such a fascinating diaspora, the Chinese Jewish diaspora, whether they're halachic or not. And that was particularly my interest. But I do think that it's very hard to deny that the original pioneers that came there was a caravan of Jewish people. But shall I go on? Yeah, Adam.
There's one question.
I want to clarify. Some of the audience might not know what halachic means. So
Okay.
if you can answer that. Also, there's a question in the Q&A box from
Yes.
Michael Snyder. So first, can you clarify halachic?
Yes, halachic means according to halacha, according to Jewish law, Orthodox Jewish law, right? According to, for example, Reform Judaism, today bilineal descent is allowed, where it can be either the father or the mother. As we'll see in the Kaifeng Jewish descendants who call themselves Kaifeng Jews, they know they're not halachic, but there's neither that. You can be a Kaifeng Jew without that father or mother, but we'll come to that later.
All right. And
Yes.
and as stated, we do have a question from Michael, who says, do we have any idea of how many Jews lived in the community at its peak?
Yes, the peak was in the Ming Dynasty, mid-Ming, around the 15th century, and it seems that it never went more than 5,000. That seems to be the maximum. Today, they say there were probably 2,000 descendants, and of those descendants, there's only a couple hundred who actively acknowledge that identity from the past, and of those, only 100 who will show up to a Passover Seder or a Sukkot festival, or, and the 20-30 that were coming to Shabbat services, but these are not allowed now. I'll come to that in the end. Yeah.
All right, that's
So
all
shall
the
I-
questions that we have. Sure, continue.
Okay, we'll go on now to where I was in the, can you see this? Yes? Yes.
Yeah.
All right. So the second part I call here global influences in Kaifeng. And as I said, the revival of Jewish identity, and this is very important to understand, was really led through a confluence of different influences in Kaifeng. In my thesis, I called this chapter the 3 E's: evangelists, entrepreneurs, and ethnologists. Because what happened once China opened up in the 70s, right? You had a lot of researchers coming. The first researcher, Wendy Abraham, came and did interviews with the community. You had people up here. This is a man named Sid Roth, who is a Jewish televangelist. I doubt he's alive now, but he came to Kaifeng in the 1970s on the famous Chrysanthemum Festival, very famous in Kaifeng. And when he announced on radio that he would like to talk to the Jews of Kaifeng, right, which a lot of Christians and Christian evangelists did for get them in first to the monotheism. What happened was all the people in the countryside, look, Kaifeng, I should add, it has a reputation. It's a very poor city. It was once very rich, and now it's one of China's poorest. And it has a reputation for like pickpockets and kind of dumb people. You know, I used to live in Sfat in Israel, and we had that reputation then, Sfatim. But in Kaifeng, it's kind of Kaifeng that has the reputation. So when people heard this broadcast that he wanted to meet, they thought he was going to give away money. And you had like a couple thousand Chinese converged on his hotel saying they were Kaifeng Jews, right? So, and you had groups like the Association of Kaifeng Jews, which was also a Jews for Jesus group. It was one of the first group. You had the Sino-Judaic Institute in California, Shushin, an ethnologist from Nanjing University, a good friend of mine, Shava Yisrael, all these different groups that came in at different times. But first, to understand, you have to go back to what I call the Chinese, oh, sorry. I went over here. My problem is I have these things blocking my view, so I can't read it entirely. So when we talk about the People's Republic of China, there was concern in the beginning when Mao Zedong first came to power. In that first year, they had a meeting, a conference of all the ethnic groups in China, and they had 2 Jews from Kaifeng come to Beijing to represent the Kaifeng Jews. But later, as they sieved through all the people claiming minority status, and they realized that you can't give it to this little group in Kaifeng because they don't really have a language. There were different criteria: no language, no boundaries, no economic profession. There were 5 things taken from Stalin, right? So then they declared the 3 no's. There was no Judaism as an official religion. That's in China, and that's valid. There really wasn't, you know, a sizable population of Jews that it should be declared an official religion. There was no ethnic Jewish minority group in China as of the 1940s, and that's true. They really couldn't be called an ethnic group, even though they had this ancestral identification. And there are no Jews in Kaifeng. That was to end the idea of that these Jews could say, hey, we were back at you, call us in as an ethnicity. They didn't want to open up the Pandora's box as a whole, not getting into it now, a whole construct to the 55 recognized ethnicities. It's all very contrived and, you know, based on manipulations, but let's leave that. They just didn't want the Kaifeng Jews to be an ethnic group. And prior to 1992, when Israel established diplomatic relations with China, there was always concern that, you know, disrupting the strong Arab alliance with China. And there was concern, I think it was misplaced concern, that there would be a reaction of Kaifeng's Hui Muslim population if suddenly the Kaifeng Jews got special recognition. And this is something that's my theory, and I'll bring it in later on. I think there was back then, and there definitely is now, although there's a lot of denial on that, there's threat of interference from the global Jewish network. Let me try and move this here. So it says, this is from official document from the Central Unity Front from June 8, 1953. This document was initialed by Mao Zedong, by Deng Xiaoping, by Lu Shiqi, all the 4 top leaders, Zhou Enlai. It says, and this is very important, they didn't want them recognized as an ethnicity, but they said we should take the initiative to be more caring for them in various activities and educate the local Han population not to discriminate against or insult them. This will gradually ease away the differences they might psychologically or emotionally feel exist between them and the Han. And in my thesis, I actually at the end, I have a little section called fast forwarding Mao Zedong. If the Chinese government today would do what Mao Zedong ordered back then, you wouldn't have the type of repression you have now. I don't know where they really lost their way and went off course of the message, but the Kaifeng Jews, you talk to them, not one of them is ever saying, we want to be an ethnic group. What they're saying is, when you talk to them, and I'm the first one that's done, I did 22 interviews, recorded interviews, the first interview since Wendy Abraham did it back in early 1980s. They all say the same thing. We just want a synagogue. We just want to be able to do what we do as a group without persecution. So this document that says take the initiative, you'd see the Chinese government helping them. And they did do that for a while, right? All right. So in 1979, things changed when Deng Xiaoping came into power and you had China opening up. And there was kind of this equation or a linkage between ethnic groups and freedom of religion. So the policy of religious freedom has been in practice since 1949. Yeah, sure. In China, the policy of religious freedom is related to our policy to ethnic minorities who usually have the most problems in religious affairs. Therefore, the policy of religious freedom must be implemented if we want to carry out a right policy to our ethnic minorities. Just to point out that, you know, during the communist era, during the Mao era, during the Cultural Revolution, the Kaifeng Jews laid low. There were times, I know that Shlomo Jin, who was the first immigrant to Israel, his, I can't remember if it's his father or uncle, I think it was his father, was paraded in the streets with the sign, you know, they had these signs, Zionist stooge, American imperialist lackey, and, you know, people, that's what they did, shaming and naming because of the association with Jews in Israel. So this was a step forward. And indeed, it was the step for the Kaifeng Jews to begin a process of learning about their heritage. Now, the second actor that we have to mention here, of course, is the State of Israel. And the State of Israel, we already spoke of Jewish law, that halacha, right, halacha has some institutionalization in Israel with the creation of the Jewish rabbinate. This was a compromise Ben-Gurion made in the beginning to get the support of the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox Jews. So you have this dichotomy in Israel where you have Jewish law rules the rabbinate and determines who is a Jew, who can marry, your divorce, and all sorts of personal proceedings. But then you have the law of return. And the law of return saying who can come into Israel as an immigrant and as a citizen was not based on halakha. It was based actually on Hitler's criteria to who goes to Auschwitz. And it said anybody that has Jewish blood, even from the paternal side, so you could have a paternal grandfather who is Jewish, and you as the grandchild, you're not halakhically Jewish, but you can become an Israeli citizen. And this has had some effect. You know, in Israel, a lot of the Russians that came in, a huge segment of them were not halakhic Jews and came to Israel and, you know, are in a pickle there if they want to marry. And some of them don't want to be forced into conversion and forced into, you know, being herded into the rabbinate. So it is an issue in Israel. And the other issue I want to mention is that the establishment of the 1992 diplomatic relations with China was a huge win for Israel. Israel is a small country, and to have a giant like that on its side, even today, and even despite some of the problems and tensions that creates with the United States, for example, having the Chinese in the Haifa's port and wanting to build the railroad from Tel Aviv to Eilat, certain things in Israeli infrastructure, but it's still very huge for Israel. And back then, that was a big win. So the first ambassador to China, Zev Sufot, one of the first things the Jewish agency had him do, go to Kaifeng, check these people out. We've been told there are Jews there. And of course, he went to Kaifeng, and by 1992, the only progress at that point that had been made was that a few Hong Kong Christians, evangelists, had made their way to Kaifeng and were starting, as Bishop White did, getting the groups together on Friday nights and doing scripture reading, right? Jews have a thing we call learning Torah, because there's, as what we call the Pardes, the orchard of Torah, there's like these levels of interpretation. But for fundamentalist Christians, it's always reading scripture. You kind of read it. And that's what they were doing. And it was a start. They got their base that way, but that's all they were doing. So what did he do? He came there and he met these people. It's like meeting Chinese. There's nothing. And he said, to claim they are Jews is absurd. There is nothing between these people and Judaism. It is obvious that this is the utter misuse of a term that has an objective meaning, not only halachic, but also an objective definition. Now, Zev Sufot was not a religious person, but just from a cultural sense, he could not accept the Kaifeng Jews as self-identifying Jews. We must deal with facts, not with make-believe. This is my expert conclusion. And the conclusion really, if you look at it, is not totally wrong. They were not Jews. You might have made the case for the fact that historically they were Jews and have lost it as self-identifying. What can we do to reinforce them? But that was not his brief at that time. All right. I'm just looking at the clock here. I'm going a little bit too slow, but let's just look at this very quickly. Another player that wanted a stake in the game was the city municipality of Kaifeng. Kaifeng, as I mentioned, is a poor city. 18% the GDP of Beijing. If you go to Kaifeng even today, you'll be like, whoa, what? This place is caught in a time warp. All the infrastructure and the modernity you see in Kaifeng, in modern day China, missed Kaifeng. And in the 90s, the vice manager of the China International Tourist Services put up a paper. He wanted to, we can use this. He could see already from the late 70s, Jews were coming. There were beginning of entrepreneurs, tour groups, and he wanted to really develop Kaifeng as a Jewish diaspora site. Like you go to Prague and there's this old synagogue that's been around for hundreds of years, and you see an old community. He wanted to kind of do the same thing, and so he established the Society for the Research of the History and Culture of Chinese Jews in Kaifeng in 1992. And the Kaifeng Ribao, which is the newspaper in Kaifeng, the local paper, what did it write about this? It said, this is a non-governmental academic society which aims to conduct systemic, all-encompassing, multi-level research on ancient Chinese Jews and Yitzhaleah history and cultural heritage, thereby strengthening our city's external culture and economic relations in the service of promoting Kaifeng and opening up to the outside along with its economy. So in short, they wanted in on the cash. And there was, for a short time, I'm not going to get into all the inter-Nissan fighting here that caused us to collapse, but there was indeed what they called the construction office for the building of a Kaifeng Jewish History Museum. It had some venerable academics like Shuxin Pangguang from Shanghai on the board. Wang Yisha, who was a famous curator, the most famous in China, was the managing director. And they got, at one point during its brief tenure, I think it was only around for a year and a half or 2 years, they had accumulated almost $1.75 million for this project. And the plan was, I'm getting like pollen infestation here. The plan was to build on the site of the old synagogue a model of a modernized model of the temple, but as a museum of Kaifeng Jewish history, get the Torah scrolls back, have a restaurant, vegan or kosher, have and build this whole complex. It was really going fairly well, apart from the fighting between the two descendants here, Jin Guangyan and Jiang Xingwan were at each other's throats all the time. Wang Yisha and Zhao Shangro, who was also kind of a charlatan, wannabe. He might have been a Kaifeng Jew, maybe not. This guy was definitely in the papers all over America as a Kaifeng Jew, but they said he was really a Muslim, all sorts of stuff. But it ultimately collapsed because of one man, Zhao Shangru, being a bit of a loudmouth and gathering together a group of Chinese Jews at the university in Kaifeng, calling for immigration to Israel, calling for reform, criticizing the Chinese government for not allowing freedom of religion. And that was it. The project was suspended in 95, I believe, and it's still suspended. It's never been canceled. And there's been steps on the way at different times. I've been in Shuxin's office just maybe 10 years ago, and there was someone on the phone talking about restarting it and contributing, but it doesn't go anywhere. No matter who you talk to in China, it doesn't seem to go anywhere, even though I think, and this is something I said in my thesis, it would be in China's interests. Why not highlight the fact that while the rest of Europe was putting Jews in ghettos and discriminating against them, you were letting them being part of Chinese culture. But okay, that's my view. And so you see here that there was this process of transculturation that took place that allowed these different phases in Chinese Jewish education. You had first a school that was funded by a Jew for Jesus as a leader. Then you had the Sino-Judaic Institute, instituting what they called the Beit HaTikva, more of a transition from just culture and Hebrew learning to religion and practice every week, the Shabbat. These are some of the first immigrants to Israel here at the bottom. This is them in their school, but I'm going to go a little faster because I'm taking too much time. All right, this is where I'm going to head off in a minute. This was my last visit to Kaifeng in 2013 when I went for a month for my research. And it's me sitting in the sukkah in Kaifeng that they built in a beautiful cultural center that the Shavei Yisrael, the organization that deals with self-identifying Jews around the world, had made for them. What's interesting is that the Chinese and Jewish calendars are the most similar calendars in the world in that they're what you call solilunar, that they have it's a lunar calendar, but you add in 1 month, an extra leap year month, in order to, for Jews, it's so that the Pesach will always be in what we call Chag HaAviv, the spring holiday. For the Chinese, you add in an extra month of the winter solstice, so that their Chinese New Year always comes a month after that winter solstice and before the spring solstice. So it's the same idea, because their Chinese New Year is also called Spring Festival. And so what happens is, because of that similarity, very often the first day of Sukkot and the first day of the festival, I'm going senile here, the festival where you look at mid-autumn festival, where you look up at the sky and see the sun and the moon and the stars, they converge. So this was the first night of Sukkot. And what's interesting, in a sukkah also, you're supposed to have enough. This is my sukkah here in the background, you see. No schach on it now, but you're supposed to see through the slots and see the sun and the stars. So it was really interesting being there. They made me a vegan meal. You can see here, they give me, I'm not a drinker, but in China, that's baiju, which is rice wine. It's very strong. And you are offensive if you reject, when they pour you baiju, if you say no, it's insulting. So I don't remember, I had about 8 cups of these as a non-drinker. That I made it back to my hotel is one of the great miracles of all time, but I did. All right. So that's a copy of my book. If you want to know, this has been a very short overview of both histories. If you want to see it in more detail, Globalization, Translation, and Transmission, Sino-Judaic Cultural Identity in Kaifeng, China. Okay, I'm not going to talk too much about it, but the idea is that globalization is not really a new phenomenon. It's been one that's been ongoing in history. And the idea of cultural hybridity is more the fact that we're constantly translating intercultural characteristics. And that is exactly that's the way culture is formed. It's a constant process. All right, I'm going to stop here now and take more. Wait, this is the end here. Yeah, so this is just the end slide I made with some of the people here. And just for your information, like this person here, Gao Chao, if you can see where my cursor is. Gao, there are 7 surnames that were part of those given by the emperor. It's Ai, Gao, Li, Jin, Zhang, Zhao, and one other. I can't remember now, but it doesn't matter. His name was Gao Chao. I always thought this guy's like from one of the clan lineages. He married to a Zhao. So this was one of the few couples where Jewish descendant married a Jewish descendant, and this Gao Chao is really the main man. He's on the picture of your flyer that you produced in the center there. He's the one that leads the services, that reads the best Hebrew. He's learned from YouTube how to be a Chazan, but he's a Han Chinese who happens to have the surname Gao. It's a common Chinese name. The emperor gave surnames that are very common to the Chinese Jews. And he married a woman who's a Zhao. She is a descendant, but because in his mind, the ancestry of his wife is a noble one, right? He's taken on to that and he's made it his own. He actually went, he did not do a formal conversion. China doesn't allow that even there, but he went and had himself circumcised, which is an amazing step for, that's the level of his commitment. So people tell me, they're in it all, they're only in it for their self-interest. I tell you, once you know these people, it's just not true. There are elements, yes, they did, they got 20 or more of their kids to Israel. That was helpful. They got money that for a while built cultural centers and places where they could study. That was helpful. But do you think they've stopped that now, even with the repression, even when these don't exist? They don't. They still do it in private and in secret, in defiance of the authorities. I'm trying now how to. I guess I move this here. I'm going to go back and stop share.
Excellent. And we do have some questions.
Okay.
So the first question comes from Frank, and he asks, could you repeat the 3 E's?
The 3 E's that came to Kaifeng: entrepreneurs, ethnologists, evangelists. That's generalizing. I mean, it was academics and, tour leaders that were the entrepreneurs, and there were evangelists that tried to, hey, fresh meat here, these wannabe Jews, let's get them into their monotheism and pack them off into our train.
Excellent. Peyton asks, how large of a group is generally considered an ethnic minority group? What characteristics do they have? What characterizes an ethnic group within a country?
All right, look, you have to, for that, the Chinese did a whole social project, and really there were like 5 different qualities according to Stalin that he made that the Chinese copied. They have to be on their own land area. They have to have a unique profession. They have to have a unique language. They have to have, there were 5 different criteria that Stalin used and that the Chinese Jews didn't have. But today in China, the truth of the matter is there are really thousands of minorities, and particularly in the south, in Yunnan and in Guozhou, in these southern areas, there's all sorts of tribes. But what the Chinese did when they saw it was going to be a mess, they got these social scientists to go down and in different places lump people together that had no ethnological connection, no linguistic connection, and they were just for convenience sake lumped into ethnicities. So in answer to your question, what in general makes an ethnic group, I don't really have an answer for that in terms of other places. I know that the Chinese use these Stalinist criteria and it didn't work for the Kaifeng Jews.
Jimmy, that's interesting. So we have a couple of other questions. Well, one other question and a couple of comments. So Roy asks, can you tell us about the Jews who escaped Europe before and early into the Holocaust and went to China?
Yeah, look, I could do that. I think I'm going to defer on that one because that is such a vast topic. I can only say that China did open itself up to Jews from Europe, from Shanghai, and from Jews from Russia, from the Yishuv there and from Yeshivot, and it ended up saving countless lives. I'll say that much.
Okay.
Otherwise, we're veering way off topic. And those are Jews that were halachic Jews.
Thank you. I think we have at least one comment, but I think it's for Chaya. And I'm asking you, would you like to wait until the end of the program for that, or do you want to make your announcement now?
I was just going to mention that there is a program that's coming from the Cleveland Jewish Community Center, or the Mandel Center, together with Case Western Reserve. There's a talk about the last kings of Shanghai, but with the author of the book, Jonathan Kaufman, March 2nd, I believe, and you can find this information. So I think that's where it's more kind of, we'll answer that question, right, Moshe, about saving
Yes,
Jews.
it's just such a vast one and such an interesting one. Look, if we have the time, can I tell a short story, an anecdote from that period? Yeah. One of the religious Jews that made it out from Poland was the Amshinover Rebbe, and the Germans were constantly putting pressure. Once the Japanese took over Shanghai, right, and they actually moved, the Jews were moved into the ghetto, etc. There was a whole reconfiguration. The Germans were putting pressure on them to take these Jews out and let the Germans take care of them. We can even talk of putting them on a boat and sinking it, right? Putting them on boats in the ocean. And so this kept going on. And finally, after one of these talks with the Germans, where they wanted to actually use the cyclone bit on the, and gas them, this Japanese governor of Shanghai met with a commission of the top Jewish leaders, including the Amshinover Rebbe. And Amshinover Rebbe was a Hasidic rabbi from Amshinover, and he asked them, why do the Germans hate you so much? And the Amshinover Rebbe answered something that's true, but people don't often think of. He said, it's because we are an Oriental people, right? Jews hail from the Orient, from the East. And the Japanese governor thought about that, and that was the end of any more talk with the Germans. And that's a famous story from that time period. But in the end, though, the war ended and Shanghai was liberated, and people went to their various countries, including a lot here in Australia. But let me just, in the last 5 or 10 minutes, if I can just take you through where kind of I left off in Kaifeng and the effect now on the community. Basically, I mean, I told you I've been to Kaifeng 3 times. The first time when they were doing their first school run by a Jew for Jesus, and the community had all these questions for me. At the time, my Chinese wasn't very good, but all the questions were, what do we think about Jesus, right? And trying to tell them. The second time I was there a couple of years later, I think it was 2010, there was a split in the community because of the Christian thing. And the Sino-Judaic Institute was sponsoring what they called the Beit HaTikva, and Gao Chao, this Han kind of convert, if you want to call it, that was leading services. It was a beautiful Shabbat service. They had learned to say some of the things in Hebrew, and some of the prayers they had translated in Chinese, and they would all recite together. And it was like these things when you watch, like, Mao Zedong propaganda things and everybody, but it was beautiful. It was very Chinese. And then the third time you saw that picture of me in the cultural center, where it was really at its peak. That night when I was there, I think you had 60 or 70 people show up, which is quite a lot. A few months after that, the center was closed down, supposedly because of noise issues, but it was part of a broader campaign that's been going on by Xi Jinping, which is to close down unofficial religions, and particularly unwarranted contact with outside agencies, which the Kaifeng Jews had. Just about a month ago, or no, I guess it was 2 months ago, I got a call from Sophia Yan from the Telegraph, who wanted to go back to Kaifeng and do an article. I had been interviewed by Chris Buckley of the New York Times, who went to Kaifeng 3 years ago. So Sophia wrote me, and she went back and did write an article, and I was quoted in it. And apparently now, everybody is kind of living in a kind of fear. But just to rewind back, on the day that I actually submitted my thesis in 2016, on that very day, I got an email from Shu Xin, who was an academic in in Nanjing, but a well-placed academic. In other words, he has party contacts. He goes abroad to raise money for Jewish studies, which you wouldn't do without that. And he told me, stop all contact with the Kaifeng Jews. From here on in, it is dangerous. And sure enough, they have, we are on WeChat. I always used to get before the holidays, best wishes, happy Purim, happy Hanukkah, Shana Tova, silence, because there is an element of fear there. And Sophia Yan did write that in her article, how, people are teaching their kids and they're afraid to meet and they're afraid of what neighbors will say. I mean, it's not the critical type of fear of someone that's been arrested by the Chinese government as detained. It's more a fear of what, you live in these areas and you have neighborhood watches and people reporting things. It's that scale, but it's still kind of a repressive system that they're functioning under. What happened after that article went out on the Telegraph, and this always happens when things are then translated, into the Jewish media. How was it portrayed? I saw several things. Anti-Semitism in China. There is no anti-Semitism in China. Xi Jinping is an equal opportunity oppressor. He oppresses everybody the same way, whether they're Chinese, whether they're Jews, whether they're Muslims. You can't do this. He couldn't care less about people speaking Shabbat or learning Hebrew or whatever. What he cares about is you don't contact people in America. You don't contact people in Israel. I mean, I'm sure they contact their kids in Israel. It can't be that strict. But, contacting people from these organizations. And yes, it's going to, if you're asking me, will it always be this way? No, China goes through phases. A lot of it is how they're going to take this new authoritarianism of Xi Jinping, because it's the first time since Mao Zedong that you have a leader that, you have Xi Jinping thought, that everything he says every week is out in the news and people hang on every word. How much they'll be willing to capitalize on that before it swings back. I mean, don't forget, they did the same thing. Mao's Little Red Book was out there in the 1970s. I was waving it around in the 1970s, and by 1979 it became irrelevant. So things change and they swing from back and forth. And really, apart from the Kaifeng Jews, I would say the repressive model. I'm with the China-Australia Writing Center at Curtin. I don't even know what the future of that is now, because China and Australia are having a tough time of things, and we'll have to see where that goes. But even the scholars I know in China, they can hardly function. They can't do a Google search. They can't use the internet properly because everything is blocked for them. So I don't think that, I think in this day and age, there's a limited shelf life to that kind of repression. But that's just my view. So I'll leave you here because I've talked far too long. And I just hope, look, it's a quick overview of the history and a really quick overview of the current situation. But I think it gives you an idea of how things have developed. And I think actually, halachic Jews or not, I think it's a fascinating community. And there's so much to learn from, in the historical sense, when you get into their theology, for example. We Jews that lived in Europe, a lot of the theology, if you read our stuff on every holiday, we're talking about oy vey, they nearly killed us. We were decimated, we were saved. Let's eat on Purim now, they tried to destroy us, let's get drunk. There's none of that in the Chinese thought, because everything bad that happened were always droughts, the flooding of the Yellow River. And it wasn't just against the Jews by the evil goyim, the evil non-Jews. It was nature against everybody. So you have this theology that's quite different and quite interesting. And, I know it's not accepted Jewish theology, but it really, in its translation and in its signified form, it's something that has a mind and principles of its own and well worth examining and certainly not forgetting, and that's the problem these days, because they lost the halakhic status. People ignore that diaspora. And you mustn't forget that they kept the synagogue there You know, a teeny 5,000 Jews in China is nothing. It's a drop in a, like a little dropper in an ocean, you know, and yet they kept a synagogue for 700 years from 1163 to 1849, always rebuilding it at their own expense. I mean, it's a remarkable community. And just to say, oh, well, they're not really Jews, are they? Bye-bye, is such a small-minded attitude. So that's what I have to say. I know I've spoken for far too long, but thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Moshe. I just wanted to just make an observation. I mean, this series for us, the Jews around the world, is this idea that there are Jewish pockets. There's pockets of Jews in many countries, and they have their own story to tell. And some of them take on the mannerisms or the looks or the behavior of the country that they, architecture, clothing, music, like we see it in other diasporas, but it's important for us to acknowledge them and to recognize that, hey, give us a country and we'll tell you about its Jews. That's the way
I think that's very important. And don't forget that that's happening all the time. Don't think that American Jews have not integrated part of America in there. Go to Italy, watch Italian Jews, very different. French Jews, different than English Jews. Any place you go to, it's transculturation all the way up, all the way down. These are not exceptions here. And that's why I think it's important not to forget them.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Adam, do you want to say anything to Jacob?
No, I just want to thank everybody once again for coming. I've dropped links for one of our upcoming events in the chat. Do we have a way to share the other events in the chat for people? We have
Right.
coming up.
So the next program that we have are the Jews of Ethiopia on March 23rd. So I don't know how to do this chat thing, but we will try and make people aware of it. March 23rd is our next one. It's Ethiopia, and then it's Morocco in April.
So if you're, I'm
Morocco's
sorry.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. If anyone is interested, I've left my email, jaylabenz@ysu.edu, and I can provide you with information and sign you up for a mailing list where you'll get the appropriate sign-up links and everything else. And on the note of Moroccan Jews, it's called the Sultan's Communist, and it's about identity and politics after World War II. It's really going to be a fascinating talk and a new and I think hopefully influential. Thank you.
Good. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Sandra, for putting this together as always. Thank you, Moshe. Enjoy the
Thank
day.
you.
We're going to sleep. You're up.
That's right.
I'm up and about. Yep.
Yeah.
It's getting hot
Summer.
here too. It was 100 degrees yesterday. It's a little cooler today.
Wow. I can go for some of that.
It's cold and
I'm
icy.
sure.
Cold and icy here.
I know. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
All right.
Take care.
Bye. Thank you.
Everybody.
Thank you for hearing me.
Thank you.
Bye.
Sandra,
And
you
to
want
all
to
of
say?
our guests, thank you very much. We appreciate you participating and we look forward to seeing you at the next time. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Do you want to stay until